Attorney Powell, I want you to feel free. I think we got the background out of the way, and I have a whole host of other questions that I want to ask, and I can tell you, the viewing audience nationwide and around the country, I'm sure that they have things that they like to hear about that happen, because this really set a precedent for other places in the country. What you did on that Police Accountability Task Force became a module or a model for other cities to use in trying to address the problem between bridging the gap between the African American community and law enforcement, not just in Chicago, but throughout America, Baltimore, Ferguson, you name it. Attorney Powell, you had some things that you wanted to ask Professor Stone.
Absolutely, and thank you. You know, Randy and Lou, you know, part of my background is fair housing, and fair housing to me is a subset of the civil rights movement. And I was taught, you know, from my father and, you know, from my elders in the community, is that a lot of times you have to tell the man what you want. You have to force the man, in authority to a position that you need to be in. Vis-a-vis Dr. King in terms of Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson, you both know, was a very complex man, a man from the South, a man that after President Kennedy was murdered, became the president, and quite frankly, he did a lot towards civil rights. I don't think he got a lot of credit for it, but part of that was because Dr. King forced him to. He put him in a position where he's talking about fighting communism in Vietnam, yet black people are getting beat like nothing in Selma, South, so forth and so on. Professor Stone touched upon an area, you know, briefly I wanted to come back to if we could, in terms of the embarrassment. Lou, you mentioned it as well. This was a national embarrassment, you know, to the city of Chicago. Actually, quite frankly, embarrassment to Rahm Emanuel. Rahm Emanuel is a national figure because of his role as a former congressman, the chief of staff for President Obama. This was an embarrassment because it happened on his watch. When that young man, Mr. McDowell, got shot 16 times, in the aftermath, you had young people demonstrating in the street. You had people laying in the street. To me, that was like a tipping point in terms of forcing the mayor to do something. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, I mean, you're absolutely correct. One of the things when I talk to students about students always want to know, well, how can we affect change? What can we do to make things better? And there has to be a diverse approach. You know, people have to understand what they can do, stay in their lane and do it. So, but the idea, you're not going to move things unless there are people willing to make a commitment, willing to get out in the streets. And a lot of what's happening today is driven by these young people, you know, in the various groups, Black Lives Matter, etc., that are out here demanding change. You know, there's a role for lawyers and law students, and, you know, we work with the courts and we can focus on reform as well. But unless the public, and that's across the board, black, white, Latino, are out there pushing the people in power to make the changes, it's not going to happen. And I think we owe a debt to these young people who are out here demanding change.
I think that you're absolutely right. I always tell people, you know, we're getting a little bit older, Randy, but I am always inspired. One of the positive things about teaching is that it keeps us connected with the next generation, and it keeps us moving because their ideas are so important, and they really become the troops that have to implement many of the policy decisions that we're talking about. Let me go to another area, and this is a kickoff from what you mentioned about the race situation. We know, I think it was in 2014, that the Chicago Police Department stopped more than $250,000 basically African Americans over an 8 or 9 month period of time. Now, for the public, let me say that again. The Chicago Police Department stopped 250,000 African Americans and Hispanics over a 9-month period of time. Most of those stops did not result in the recovery of any incriminating information. Most of those stops, and let me use the legal term, didn't have probable cause, didn't have what we in the law talk about, the Fourth Amendment, reasonable suspicion. They were stopped primarily, if the implication is right, because that they were African American, which was race-based. I know that your report, the Police Accountability Report, had a section that discussed the history of racism of the police department and those stops. I want you to say something about that, because many people in the public don't know that you, not the Department of Justice, but you all made the initial finding that there was a history of racism in the department, and it worked against the integrity of the relationship between African Americans and the city and the police department.
You know, that topic, the topic of race and racial discrimination and racism, is a very sensitive one. And we had a lot of fairly contentious discussions in the task force itself and among members of our community relations group about that issue. And we came to a consensus. Now, you know, as I said, there were, 7 or 8 members of this task force, and I left 2 people out that I need to mention. Maurice Clausen, who works for the MacArthur Foundation, was also on the task force. And Deval Patrick, the former governor of Massachusetts, was also an advisor to the task force. And they both contributed to the report and to the work of the task force. We came to a consensus that it was important when we talked about racism to not appear that we were only talking about Laquan McDonald or Rekia Boyd. We wanted to go back and show this pattern and practice in history. So we went back to Fred Hampton, where the Chicago Police Department was
December
involved
1969.
in that assassination in 1969. We could have gone further, but that's where we started. We talked about the hearings that Congressman Ralph Metcalf had on the police department in the 70s, where he had hearings all around the city and focused on the way the police were treating those in the African American community, professionals, middle-class people, and working-class people. We talked about the John Burge era, where police department supervisors were torturing hundreds of African American men on the south side and the west side of Chicago, literally torturing people to get confessions, in some cases torturing innocent people to get confessions. And so we wanted to go back and to bring it all up to today to show that this is not something new and that we need to make sure we connect the dots. And one of the arguments that I always make is, there's always going to be another case. Laquan McDonald was the case for the end of 2015. Next year there'll be another case. But it's important to connect the dots and to make sure it's not about one case, it's about a history. And in order to change that dynamic, you got to know your history.
That's right.
Both African Americans as well as the larger city.
Right.
So they don't just think we're talking about some, one particular incident. We're talking about a history of incidents, and that's why you have to change the whole culture of the system. People talk about, well, there's just a few bad apples in the police department. Well, I reject that idea. We're talking about changing a whole system and culture that allows bad apples to operate and function over a 30, 40, 50-year period. And so it's not about 2 or 3 bad apples. It's about a whole system and culture that is rotten and that needs to be.
What did you find about that stopping of $250,000? Was that based on race? I mean, what was it that the members of the Accountability Task Force, what was the consensus that that was about, and what did you decide that should be done about that?
There's 3 points on that. One, as you know, New York had the same issue, right?
Absolutely. Long before us. But,
long before us. Or
it was
same
going
time.
on. Yeah.
And many other urban areas as well.
That's right.
Secondly, as you know, Chicago, 10, 15 years ago had a gang loitering ordinance.
That's right.
That was found unconstitutional, where the police were doing essentially the same thing, rounding up people, stopping them, searching them, frisking them with no probable cause. Thirdly, I think what our report found about the recent statistics that you pointed to, a lot of the police were saying, well, we got to stop these people because people in the black community commit more crimes, so therefore we need to stop more people in the black community. One of the things we noted in our report was it wasn't just the black community. If you looked on the north side in certain neighborhoods, black people were being stopped in those communities as well at a rate that far exceeded the stopping of white people. So it's across the board, it's across the city, and the task force, to its credit, laid it out in the report. We showed you where black people were being stopped in white neighborhoods at rates that were far disproportionate to their numbers, to counter this view that, we just stop them in the black neighborhoods because they're committing crime. It's citywide. And, that's another cultural thing that has to be changed. And as a result of the report and the Department of Justice report as well, and more publicity about these issues, I think we have the possibility of creating meaningful change. But once again, it's going to take a lot of pressure.
Let me ask you, what were some of the other, time is moving on us, but it's so much. I mean, man, we need about a 10-part series on this. What are some of the other recommendations at the conclusion of the investigation by the Police Accountability Task Force? What were some of the things that the task force decided? The public, believe it or not, Professor Stone, does not know. I mean, I find every day, and including a lot of my students, don't know what the recommendations and findings were. And to me, many of them are so important that it's a disservice not to continue to highlight them because people need to know about them. What are some of the areas and some of the recommendations that you all made?
Well, we made over 100 recommendations,
Right.
And we tried to be as comprehensive as possible. All of the recommendations and the report are on the web, chicagopatf.org. You can download the whole report. You can download the recommendations. You can download the executive summary. There are videos of the town hall meetings that we held around the city. You can go on the website and actually look at the town hall meetings that we held on the north side, the west side, the south side. So some of the recommendations, and as I said, there are over 100. Let me say one of the first recommendations we made that has been ignored pretty much, and that is that the city and the police department need to acknowledge the history of racism as it relates to law enforcement and the African American community. That's one of the first recommendations we made. You never hear about it. Nobody ever talks about it. And it was difficult to get it in the report because it's obviously controversial. But the consensus at the end was that ultimately you can't make change unless you acknowledge the problem and the history of the problem. Somebody has got to step up and say, here are the facts. The Chicago Police Department has historically discriminated against its people of color in this city. But here's what we're going to do about it. We're going to acknowledge that it occurred in the past, and we're going to put together a plan to solve it so it doesn't go into the future. You can't change the present without acknowledging.
Why do you
the
think
history.
that nobody's acted upon that? I'm just curious.
Well, because it's hard. It's hard.
It's harder for people to accept the reality of it. It's
Exactly.
harder.
It's harder to
say,
accept
hey,
the reality. It's hard to acknowledge it. A lot of folks in the city probably know the history,
Absolutely.
but until somebody gets the nerve and the gumption to stand up and publicly acknowledge it and say, you know this, as you've been in this area for a long time, and Lou, you know as well when you deal with fair housing. If people are unwilling to acknowledge the source of the problem, you're not going to make much change. You're going to make some change around the edges, but you're never going to deal with the source. And so people are reluctant to even talk about race,
Yeah.
let alone admit that,
That's right.
that there's a history of
That's
race.
a historical problem. But what are some of the other recommendations? Just a brief, some that you think that ought to be highlighted for the public.
Okay, well, one, we dealt with the video release issue, right? We agreed
That
that
involved,
the
the
policy-
problem with Laquan McDonald,
Right.
and a year going by, it was
Exactly.
never released, and
So
the community felt violated by that.
Exactly. So we set a default, period of time that the city must release all videos related to shootings, police shootings, within a very discrete period of time, unless there's some abnormal reason not to. Now, I think it was a very small piece of the report, but a very important one, because what created the problem with Laquan McDonald, it's not so, in addition to what happened, was the fact that they suppressed the information for so
That's
long.
right. That's
And
right.
that created
That's
more and more frustration.
Right.
We looked at de-escalation. So we
Tell us what that means.
what
A lot
what
of
that
people get.
means is when the police approach a situation, they have a lot of options as to how they want to handle it. What we're saying is your first option should be to assess the situation and figure out, how can I use the least amount of force as possible? How can I rectify this situation with the least amount of force and violence? It sounds common sense, but what we want the police to begin to look at is that not only do they have a warrior function, but they have a guardian function. And we want them to start thinking about our community as a community that they need to protect and to guard and to serve, not one that they are looking at as one that they're going to attack and to confront.
Let me
So
ask
we
you
want
this.
them to change their mindset. So there are a number of recommendations in there that focus on de-escalation.
Was there any discussion among you about excessive force?
Great question. When we first started the task force, there was a lot of discussion. When we got the word from the Department of Justice that they were going to come in and do their report, and we were told that the Department of Justice wanted the issue of force and excessive force to be their bailiwick. So we did not spend, and as you read the Department of Justice report, a lot of their report is focused on the appropriate use of force, the unconstitutional use of excessive force, violence, etc. in their report. So they ask us not to focus on that issue, and we agreed, and that's the issue that a lot of their report is concerned with.
What was it, because we're getting toward the end, what was it, was a consensus, and you sit there and you heard the community meetings, and you had the benefit of sitting in the room with members of the Accountability Task Force. I think that you previously used the term contentiousness. Even within the room, there were people who were torn about which way we should go, which way is up, which way is down. At the end of the day, what were your feelings, if any, about how could the gap be bridged in the city of Chicago, in particular, between the Chicago Police Department, the people that you heard as a community relations person? Can we bridge the gap? And if so, how or why, or is that not realizable?
No, I think it absolutely is realizable. It is absolutely doable. We can create a community that trusts the police if we can create a police force that respects the community. And I think we can do it. And we've laid out some recommendations in the report. One of the things we talk about is this community policing. What is it? How do you define it? And what comes through in our report is that community policing has to be a philosophy, not a program in the police department, but a philosophy that is embedded into all the police in the city, from the academy to the veterans, so that the police officers and the police function is looked at as serving the citizens, is looked at as helping and guarding and protecting. One of the big issues right now I'm working on is this clearance rate. And by that I mean the responsibility of police to solve murders and violent crimes. Our police department is clearing murders at about less than 30%.
Yeah, I'm aware of that.
Which is less than half the rate in most major cities.
That's
So
right.
we've got people who have shot and killed other people
Walking around.
thinking that they will never be brought to justice.
And probably out shooting other people.
It could be.
Lou, we're running on a time schedule. Do you have any closeout questions you want to ask Professor Stone?
You know, Rand, I just want to try to sum it up if I can, Lou. I think what you're doing is I tell myself, is next level. Because as you said earlier, you're trying to bridge the gap. You said something that's very key, very key. You said it is possible if people are serious, I'm talking about the powers that be, that we can have a police department that respects the community. Because you said something that was very profound to me. Not attacking the community, but holding the community in respect, i.e., my job is to serve and protect, not to harass you for any unnecessary reasons. Can you elaborate, just tie it in on that last point?
Well, I mean, it's throughout the report. There has to be, if you want to improve the clearance rate, if you want to solve more murders and serious crime, you have to have the trust and respect of the community. Because people are not going to talk to you and help you do your job if you're disrespecting them. So it's all tied together. Effective policing can occur unless there is a relationship between the community that the police are in and the police.
What's the first step, and now I'm being a professor, what's the first step in starting that process? We admit that there's tension, almost irreconcilable tension, because people are not talking. So if people want to talk, if the police wants to talk, and if members of the community want to talk, what is the visual process to start that?
Great question. One of our major recommendations that's also pretty much ignored is that the police department create a diversity officer of high rank in the department. And that diversity officer would be charged with creating this environment that you just talked about. By making sure, number one, that the training police officers receives reflects this philosophy, that they receive training in cultural competency, so when they go into communities that are different than they are, they get some training on how to deal with people. You know, one of the things we noted, you know, a lot of police officers, when they're hired, they're rookies, and they're sent to some of the most dangerous neighborhoods in the city because the senior officers have seniority. So they can select out and go to the communities where, you know, they're not as needed, and it's not as dangerous. So you need to look at that. You need to look at training. We thought that training, and the Department of Justice report backs us up on this. The training that police officers receives has to be brought into the 21st century. They're still showing videos that are 10 and 15 years old at the training academy. So there's a lot
Yeah.
of different
This has
areas
been,
that can
this
be.
has been so exciting. We're going to have to do a part 3, 4, 5, and 6 on this because we didn't even get around to the DOJ, Department of Justice report, how that came about. Looks like now it may be at the bottom of the barrel, i.e. Attorney General Jeff Sessions appearing to indicate that it's not going to be a priority in the new administration. Let me close out. You have any closing words you want to say? Because this is going out. No, Professor Stone?
Well, I'm doing a talk next Thursday with the Illinois Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. And I think the title of it's a discussion. I'm not doing a speech, it's a discussion. Is Defending in the Age of Trump, which is right on your point. Now that we're moving into this new era, what should criminal defense lawyers begin to think about and do differently, if anything? But we're moving into a new era. We've got an attorney general who is not sympathetic at all to police reform, who claims he's wants to support law enforcement to the extent of ignoring community needs. So this is a very difficult transitional time that
Well,
we all need to think about how we want to adjust going forward.
Well, I think that this has been a very delightful, helpful discussion. And I'm certainly, I hope that not just ordinary citizens, but everybody who is listening to this, I'm sure they're taking away some very important points. Let me thank you. I want to thank you for serving on the task force of accountability. And of course, I want to compliment you for your years of service. You have been dedicated. I can testify to that, to the African American community. You've been concerned about our rights and the rights of poor people in general. And the next time we talk, we're going to have to go to Miller versus Alabama. And because I also teach juvenile justice and talk a little bit about what's going on. But again, let me thank you so very much, and I'm looking forward to continue this.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's been a great opportunity.